Well, it's great to be here. We're currently in release week for VS Code, so nice to take a little bit of a break from that to talk about Copilot. So again, I'm Matt Bierner. I've been working on VS Code for around, I think, 8 years or so now, kind of flown by. But I work on the JavaScript, TypeScript support, various Markdown things, API things related to VS Code. But more recently, and what I want to talk about today, is Copilot, and specifically how you can go and ask Copilot questions about code in your workspace. So if you've used Copilot or seen any of the demos, you know that you can ask Copilot questions about general programming things. You can get it to help you with things like that. But I find that when I'm programming, a really common thing that I want to do is actually ask about code for a project that I am working on. So first, let's just kind of lay out what this actually might look like. So there's a few different types of questions that we might be wanting to ask about the project that we just are working on. For example, let's say that I just downloaded a new project, and I am wondering, how do I actually build this? Now, I could look in the README or the contributing file or kind of try to scan through the code and maybe figure this out. But this is something that maybe Copilot would be able to help with as well. So I could ask Copilot, hey, how do I build this project? And it would provide a quicker summary of how you actually go about building this project. So that's one type of thing that I might want to ask. It's just a general purpose question about the code base. And this is useful both for beginners, but also if you've been working on the project for a while, if you're just wanting some general high-level information about your code base. Another example question that we might want to ask is something like, where's the code that does something specific? So an example here would be, where is the code that adds request headers for HTTP requests, for instance? Now, VS Code has plenty of tools for finding like specific text matches or symbol matches, for instance. But in this case, what we're looking for is a little bit more fuzzy, because maybe we don't know the exact symbol we're looking for, or we don't know exactly what text is going to be in the code. We just want to be able to describe what we're looking for and have Copilot return a reference to somewhere in our code base where the request headers are getting added. So we can do a little bit more like fuzzy matching and hopefully get back some references in our code base. Another type of thing we might want to do is actually get Copilot to answer questions about either contributing to the code or how to do something in the context of the current code base. So a good example of this is, how can I sort an array? Now this question is particularly interesting because there's probably a general purpose response that Copilot could provide. So if you're working in JavaScript, for instance, you might use the array sort method. But if you're working on a project, there might actually be a more specialized implementation of sort that has some different performance characteristics, or maybe is more specialized for the data structures you're working with that you actually want Copilot to answer with instead. And these are the types of things that we might want Copilot to have workspace knowledge when it's going and responding to our various questions here. So if you try asking any of these questions to Copilot on its own, it is not going to have enough information to actually answer them. So it doesn't have direct access to the contents of your workspace. It can see where your cursor is. It can see like your current selection, some various file names. It can see the general type of project you're working in, but it won't be able to just scan through your entire project and answer any of these questions. And that's where we get into the @workspace chat participant. So @workspace is a chat participant, again, and the way that you use it is at the start of a question that you're asking to Copilot. You would just say @workspace and then the question or prompt that you actually want to have Copilot answer. So for instance here, we could say something like, @workspace, where's code folding implemented? Now, instead of using its general purpose knowledge to try to answer this question, because this is something that Copilot probably wouldn't be able to provide a very reasonable response to without actually looking in your workspace, it is now going to use two different things. So when we involve @workspace, we're going to get, first off, a custom system prompt. Now this system prompt is behind the scenes instructing Copilot with instructions that we are looking for a workspace-specific response. We're not looking for a general programming response. We're looking for a response that is going to consider things in our workspace and answer that question just for our workspace. So that's the first thing that you get when you involve @workspace. The other thing we get, though, and this is actually the more important one, is that we're automatically going to generate relevant context that is going to be used to help Copilot answer this question. So when we're asking a question like, where is code folding implemented, we'll probably want to go and look in various files to find methods, classes, symbols related to code folding, and maybe some of the tests as well. If we ask how to build this project, we'll probably want to look in maybe the README, contributing file, maybe the package.json file, and we're going to go and include that information from your workspace, so actually like snippets of code and stuff from your workspace, so that Copilot can hopefully have a better shot of answering the questions that we're asking about our current project. Now, what's actually in this context that we're going to provide? Because it does help to understand a little bit more about what's going on behind the scenes. This context is generated automatically, but we do need to know a little bit about what is part of that. Now, the core problem that we have is that in many cases, the workspace that you're in, the projects that you're working on, it's just too big to feed directly into Copilot. So just as an example, there are over 300 million characters of TypeScript in the VS Code project. And that's just like main TypeScript files. That's not getting into dependencies. That's not getting into all like the other types of files that you might have in your project. So we just can't feed that amount of information into Copilot and expect a reasonable response. And even if you can feed in a whole lot of information, oftentimes it's better to feed in more focused information to these language models so that you get a better response. Sometimes they kind of get overwhelmed and end up missing important things, whereas if we can kind of narrow it down to just the most relevant pieces of information, that's going to help it along and hopefully provide a better response. So when we're generating this context, we include two pieces of information that are going to help Copilot in answering these questions. First off, we include a file system structure. So we tell Copilot, here's some file names in our project, here's some directory names in our project, and that will give it a general sense of the type of project that we're working in. Maybe you can see that, hey, there's a package.json file, for instance, or there's an out file where we're probably generating compiled code. So this is going to give it a general sense of the type of project that we're working in. The next part, and probably the more important one, though, is the relevant code snippets. So we're going to look through your workspace, look at the current question that you're asking, and try to find the most relevant code snippets that could answer that question. And a code snippet could be something like a class, it could be a method, it's whatever we think is going to help Copilot answer the question. This also could include like documentation that's in your workspace, any documentation comments. Those could also be included as part of these code snippets. Just as an example of what one of these code snippets might look like that we actually send over to Copilot, here's an example snippet that we actually would send over. So behind the scenes, Copilot is automatically going to get this code snippet if we ask, where is code folding implemented? And you can see we're telling Copilot, here's the file name. And then in this instance, we're passing in the method here. And that is the interesting part that we're sharing with Copilot. We're also providing a little bit of extra context. So we're saying, hey, this method is inside of this class up here, for instance, and there's stuff before and after this method. But we're giving Copilot this information so that it knows about this method and where it occurs, so they can hopefully provide the best answer possible when answering our question. So that is what is being built up automatically. Again, you don't have to include any of this. It is just going to be passed to Copilot for you whenever you use @Workspace. All right, so that's the basic idea behind @Workspace. Let's take a look now at actually using @Workspace in action. So I'm going to go over to VS Code here. I have the Copilot chat extension installed. I've signed in and done everything. And in this case, I am working on the VS Code Markdown Language Service project. So this is the project that implements many of VS Code's Markdown features. So the outline, for instance, with Markdown, the path completions for Markdown. But let's pretend for a second that I have just downloaded this project for the first time, and I'm wondering how to get started on it. So if I was using Copilot, the first thing I might do is actually go over to Copilot here and ask something like, how do I build this? And you can see that in this case, I did not actually include @Workspace. And we're going to get back, because I didn't include @Workspace, we're going to get back a really generic response. So again, out of the box, Copilot can see things like your cursor, your current selection, some of the open files, maybe some diagnostics, other things related to your current view here, but it can't see your entire workspace. So it's generated this really generic response. And it's saying, well, this looks like a TypeScript project. Here's a bunch of kind of generic instructions you could use to actually build TypeScript code. So running node-v, and like that might be what you want in some instances, but here it's really not what we're after. We're wanting to know how to build this specific project. And that's where we can use @Workspace. So let's go in here. And instead, I'm going to say @Workspace. And you can see that when I type the @ sign, I got some nice completions here. So it's going to help me and say, here are some chat participants. So I'm going to say @Workspace, how do I build this? And now it's going to, again, scan through our workspace, find the most relevant information that it can to actually answer this question. And we're going to hopefully get back a much more scoped and helpful response that is going to help us get started contributing to this project. If we look at the response here, you can see that it is more confident that it is a TypeScript project now, and it's telling us the different steps we can take to actually build this. So it's saying npm install and then run compile, and these are defined even in this package.json file. So it's also telling us that where it found the information here. I can even click on this package.json file link, and it's going to open that up so that we could go and inspect this ourselves. So that is a whole lot more helpful than the really generic response we were getting before. And again, that's all coming just because we used that @Workspace chat participant at the start, so it could consider the entire workspace when answering our question here. So pretty cool. And again, always make sure to include @Workspace when you're asking these type of questions. All right, so that's asking a general purpose question about the workspace. But what if we wanted to actually find something in our current code base? So maybe we're wanting to make a contribution somewhere. How do we go about actually doing that? And again, we can use @Workspace for that. So let's go back over to chat. And let's say at Workspace, maybe we're interested in working on the code folding support for Markdown. So this lets you, for instance, collapse a section of headers in a Markdown document. So I'm going to say at Workspace, where's code folding implemented? And again, because we're using at Workspace, it's going to scan through, find all the code related to code folding, and hopefully generate the best response it can using that information. In our response here, you can see that it's telling us that code folding is implemented in this class here, in this file, so in the folding.ts file. And I can just click on folding.ts. It's going to open that up. I could also click on the class name, and it's going to jump to the class definition over in folding.ts. Now, the response here is pretty short. It's a pretty concise response, I think just 2 sentences or so. So we actually might want a little bit of extra information, and we can use a follow-up question to hopefully get Copilot to provide a little bit more of an explanation here. This might be what you want in some instances, but sometimes you want a little bit more information. So over here in chat, I'm going to actually press the up arrow key so I can access the history of the chat. And you can see that it's now filled in the last question that I asked. And I'm going to say, where's code folding implemented? And also provide code examples to explain. Now it's going to also go scan through the workspace and find hopefully useful code samples that it's going to use to answer our question here. And give it a moment as it's coming up with the response. Now you can see at the start of the response here, it's pretty much the same information. But after that, it's now generating additional context and additional information that we requested. So it's actually sharing some code samples that it's found, and that these are taken actually from our workspace itself to explain how code folding is implemented. So just by adding that extra instructions in our prompt, we're able to get a more useful response that is closer to what we were looking for. So always helpful to be very explicit about what you're looking for when you're dealing with Copilot, and also ask these follow-up questions as well when you don't get back quite the response that you're looking for. So that's how you can go and find some, how you can find code in your project. But what about actually writing code? So maybe we now want to go and add some tests for code folding. Well, we can also use at Workspace for that. And when you use at Workspace to write new code, what it's going to do is take the relevant snippets in your project and use that and consider them when it's generating the new code. So let's go back here, and we're going to go into the chat and say at Workspace, write some new tests for code folding. So now again, it's going to look at all of our existing tests for folding. It's going to look at the folding implementation, hopefully generate some new tests that we can add for code folding here. So we're actually using it to write code now. In this case, if we actually look at the tests that are being generated, hopefully these are some good ones. And you can see that it's also told us that there's an existing test file. So there's a folding test file here that has the existing tests, and these are now some existing ones that we could consider adding to our list there. Now, one useful part of the UI that I want to point out here is the references that are listed up here. Now, I said that when we generate the context for at Workspace, so when we're looking through your workspace for what information to include, that is all done automatically. And in many cases, you don't actually have to think about what context is being included, because if you get back a response that you're happy with, that's great. But let's say that the response you got back isn't quite what you were looking for. That's where it's helpful to sometimes look at the context that we passed over to Copilot to help answer the question. And that context is available or listed in these references here. So I can actually go over to my reference list, and I'm just going to click on this, and now I can see the different code snippets from my project that Copilot used to answer this question. Again, these were generated automatically for me whenever I used at Workspace. So in this instance, I have a reference from the main folding file here and a reference from the folding test file here. And can actually go and click on these to see the different sections of code that Copilot was using to generate this response. This is probably going to be most helpful if you get a Copilot response back that is not quite what you're looking for. So maybe you're working on a complex project that has a bunch of sub-projects in it. If Copilot maybe found some of the code in a sub-project, you could then see the references that are being picked up, and maybe they're all coming from that sub-project, and go and tweak your prompt so that you get back a better response. So you can use these references. Again, you don't need to look at them all the time, but it can be a helpful way to go and debug issues with your Copilot response and just to understand a little bit more of what's going on behind the scenes. All right, so now we've written some tests for code folding. Let's actually now finally use at Workspace to add a new feature. So I'm going to go over here and say, let's do at Workspace again. So at Workspace, and then say, how can I add support for folding these triple colon blocks in Markdown? So now I'm actually going to get Copilot to help out by adding a new feature to my code. So I've had it kind of explain how to get started on the project, had it write some tests. Now we're actually wanting to go and add some new features here. And you can see, again, it's considering the entire workspace, all the code in my project, considering the tests, and it's providing some hints of what we could do to actually add support for blocks that are defined with the triple colon, which is kind of a markdown extension syntax that is fairly common for different markdown engines out there. And it's provided some helpful recommendations along with these links here to various sections of our code. So we'd be able now to actually go and start adding support for folding using this information that Copilot has provided. So Workspace is great when you're wanting to ask a question about your entire code base. And you can see that we were able to provide context for you automatically. And in many cases, that's really all you need. So you're just wanting to ask a question, not have to think about including specific files or anything like that. But if you're ever wanting to get something a little bit more focused, where you're asking about a specific file in your code base, there are ways to do that as well. So let's go into the code folding file here, and I'm actually going to scroll up. Let's go to the provide folding ranges method here. And let's say that we're really interested in just this method and understanding how this is used. Now, VS Code includes some variables that you can use to reference specific parts of your code. So in this instance, if we're just interested in our current selection, we can use the hash selection variable to reference that in our chat here, instead of like copying and pasting this code over into the chat. So this is, again, it's going to use a specific part of our code base instead of looking at the entire code base. So I'm going to say over here in chat, explain, and then I'm going to say hash, and then selection. And this is going to be a stand-in for my current selection over here in the active editor. So I'm going to say explain selection. Now, in this instance, we actually have a explain command that you could also use as kind of shorthand for this, that is going to have a few extra functionality, bits of extra functionality as well. But we're just wanting to get a basic explanation here. I could also do something more fancy, which our normal /explain command would not do. So I could say explain selection as a poem. And now we're going to get back the selection explained as a poem instead of a normal helpful explanation here. So very nice poem that we've written now explaining the current selection. Now, you can also combine these variables with the @workspace chat participant in some interesting ways. So if I go in here, let me get my selection again for provide folding ranges. I'm going to now use the current selection along with @workspace. So I'm going to say @workspace here, and I'm going to ask where's, and then I'm going to say selection tested. And now we're asking for, in the context of our entire code base, where is this current selection that I have being tested? And hopefully it's going to be able to find the tests here. And sure enough, it's found the folding.test file here. And we're able to, again, reference our current selection explicitly using that selection variable, but then include information about the rest of our code base by using @workspace here. So that's one of the variables that you can use. Now, if you instead want to ask about the entire current file that you're working in, we could use the editor variable. So this is going to be hash editor. And this will let us ask questions about the entire editor. So we could say something like, what does, and then we'll say hash and then editor. And we're just going to say, what does this editor do? And this is, again, the currently active editor. It's not just the current selection. And we're able to now ask a question about the entire editor that we have open over here. I'm just going to stop that because we're getting back an explanation that seems to be right. And one final variation that I want to show for these variables is that you can ask questions about specific files in your workspace. So with @workspace, again, it is going to kind of automatically determine what information to include. By using the file variable, you're able to explicitly say, hey, I want this file to be the focus of the question. So we're able to guide Copilot in the right direction by including a file specifically. So let's take a look at that. So over here in chat, I'm going to say, what does, and then I'm going to say hash and then file. And this one's a little bit different because you're actually now including a specific file that you have to select. So you can see I get this quick pick here that's a list of all files in my code base. I can just start typing. So I'm going to say something like completions here. And I'm going to choose the path completion file. And now I'm going to say, what does file? And that's the path completion file. And I'm going to ask, what does that file do? So now we're asking a question very specifically about that one file in our code base. You could actually include multiple files if you wanted to as these variables. But in this case, I just wanted to learn about this one file in my code base. Oftentimes, you'll just want to be using @workspace because it will do all of this automatically. But if you ever want to just reference maybe the README file or maybe just a single file and really get a summary of it or have it generate code just for that one file, you can use these variables instead. And you can also combine them with @workspace as well. So that's some quick looks at how you can use @workspace. All right, a few more details about actually working effectively with @workspace here. So some tips. This kind of applies to all Copilot questions, but try to be precise about what you want. Copilot isn't magical. It can't read your mind. You saw that when we first asked where code folding was implemented, it provided a very short and concise response. That might be what you want. But if we actually wanted more explanation, we had to give it a few extra prods to say, hey, actually, we want some code samples that that explain where code folding is implemented. So try to be precise about what you're looking for. If you have a complex project, try to give it some hints so it can find the specific area of your project that you're interested in if there could be multiple potential responses. So just keep in mind that you sometimes need to be a little bit more precise. If you have a smaller project or are looking for something that is very precise in your workspace, you may be able to get away with something that's a little bit more vague. But in general, if you're not getting the response that you want, try giving a little bit more instruction to Copilot so it has some hints on what you're looking for. This also kind of ties into the next point, which is ask follow-up questions. With Copilot, I, in general, see quite a few times where people will ask a single question and they won't get back the response that they want, and they'll say, oh, Copilot, it's not working, I give up. So that is really not the most effective way to use Copilot. Instead of treating it more like a search engine where you're just hoping to get back the magic perfect result the very first time, think of your Copilot conversation more like a conversation where you're going to have some back and forths. Maybe there'll be some misunderstandings and you have to clarify things. You can see that we could ask the follow-up questions where we said, hey, add some extra code samples here. So treat it more like a conversation instead of always hoping to get the single best response. And I've found that that's a whole lot better for generating useful responses with Copilot. Now, a few limitations of @Workspace, and these are current limitations. They may change in the future, but just things to be aware of so you know what type of questions @Workspace can actually answer today and which ones it can't. So first big limitation, @Workspace is not magic. It can't do something like fix all bugs in this project. That's just beyond the scope of what we're able to do, and who knows what a bug even counts as. So that's just too vague, too broad. We'd love to be able to support something like that in the future, but for right now, it is a little bit more limited. So you can't do overly vague things like that right now. Another thing that @Workspace and Copilot is not so good at in general are answering questions where there's a very specific answer, or like IntelliSense type questions. A good example of this would be like, how many JS files are in my project? Another example would be, how many times is this symbol used? Now, these are questions that you can use normal tooling, like you can use VS Code's normal IntelliSense to say find all references on a symbol to actually see all the references. And it's going to be very reliable. It's going to be pretty fast. Copilot, though, is not so good at answering that type of question. Even if you actually feed all of like a list of JavaScript files over to Copilot, sometimes it's just going to get the wrong response. It's going to count everything incorrectly. So keep in mind some of these limitations. Again, we may relax them in the future, and we're hoping to improve them, but these are some limitations that I've seen people run into and then be a little bit frustrated just because they're not quite aware of what Workspace is designed for right now. And then finally, Workspace right now, it only has access to the current state of the file, or of the workspace. It does not have access to like the Git history, it doesn't have access to your GitHub issues, it doesn't have access to online documentation, so it is limited to looking at the code in its current state. And just keep that in mind. It also is going to only look in files that are part of your project. It will not look at things that are in your git ignore, for instance. So just keep in mind these limitations when you're asking questions. Again, things we're working on improving in the future, but right now these are things to remember when asking @Workspace questions. Which brings us to maybe some things for the future. So going forward, we are looking to make @Workspace faster. You can see that there was a little bit of a delay when we're asking these questions. We've already got some improvements coming that should reduce that, and are hoping to make some other optimizations in the future, but that is something that we're aware of. We also are looking to include more context whenever we're asking these workspace questions. So we try to include the most relevant information now, but if you're on a large project, sometimes there can be quite a lot of relevant information. So if a symbol is used in hundreds of places, we sometimes can't include all of that information today. And we're looking to expand that so that we can include as much information as possible that is relevant so that Copilot can provide the best response as possible. Something that's coming up that I'm excited about for May is that we're actually going to be adding better IntelliSense in the code blocks that Copilot generates. So you saw that it was generating some code snippets from our workspace, and then it can also generate new code snippets. We're looking at adding good IntelliSense so you can like hover over things or run go to definition. And if it's referencing a symbol that's actually defined in your workspace in one of those code blocks, it would actually be able to jump directly into where that symbol is defined in your workspace. So it should be pretty cool and help you understand the code blocks that are being generated a little bit better. And then finally, we're integrating all of this workspace knowledge into many other Copilot features as well. So whenever you're generating tests or doing refactorings, it's helpful to have some context on where symbols are used, some coding conventions in the workspace. So we're really looking to make a lot of different other Copilot features more aware of the project that you're working on, which is not something that always is happening today. With that, I post some tips and tricks on my YouTube channel for working with VS Code. So this is something on my Code 2020 YouTube channel. So these are not all about Copilot, it's just general purpose programming things. And then I also post some previews of things that I'm working on for VS Code and things that I'm excited about over on LinkedIn, so you can follow me over there as well. And hopefully this gives you some ideas on how you can work effectively at Workspace. Be sure to file any issues or feedback that you have on this as well, and happy coding.